The engineers and test pilots stationed at Octubinsk had one advantage almost no other Russian airbase could claim. Distance had always done most of their defending for them. 650 kilometers separate the airfield from the nearest active front line, deep enough into Russia's southern interior that for most of the war, the base's real protection was simply being somewhere Ukraine had bigger, closer problems to deal with. Nestled in the flat, sun-baked delta, where the Akhtubinsk River branches off from the Volga, the base had spent decades as a place where Russia tested its future in relative peace, far enough from any battlefield that the greatest recorded risks to anyone stationed there came from the aircraft themselves rather than an enemy. Shift change at the airfield followed the same routine it always had. Technicians walking the flight line at dusk, fuel trucks topping off aircraft scheduled for the next day's trials, security patrols working a perimeter designed to stop saboteurs on the ground rather than anything arriving from the air. In the early hours of August 20, that assumption stopped holding. Two impact points appeared on the airfield within the same short window, a fuel spill spread beside a parked aircraft, and by morning satellite imagery showed the Russian Air Force quietly relocating whatever remained undamaged to other parts of the field or moving it off the base entirely. Octubinsk is not an ordinary airbase, and that distinction is the entire reason it was worth flying this far to reach. Since 1948, the airfield has served as Russia's primary flight test establishment, formerly known as the 929th State Flight Test Center and named for the Soviet test pilot Valery Chkalov. Every major Russian combat aircraft of the last 70 years has, at some point, flown its most dangerous early missions from this stretch of runway in the Volga Delta. New airframes, new weapons, new avionics, all put through their paces here before anyone in Moscow signs off on sending them to a combat unit. The base is organized less like a single squadron and more like a small research city built around a runway. Separate scientific experimental departments historically responsible for fighters and fighter bombers, radio range testing, flight path measurement, and specialized weapons trials, each one staffed by engineers and test pilots whose entire career is spent finding out what a new piece of hardware does before it is allowed anywhere near an actual war. A town has grown up around the airfield over the decades to house that workforce, which means the base's institutional knowledge is not concentrated only in hangars and paperwork, but in generations of families who have spent entire careers within a short drive of the same runway, passing specialized engineering expertise from one cohort of test personnel to the next in a way no newly built facility could simply replicate on a shorter timeline. That work has never been without cost, even in peacetime. Test pilot fatalities were recorded at the base as early as 1948, again the following year, and again in 1963, a reminder that Octubinsk's entire institutional purpose has always been to absorb risk on behalf of the rest of the Russian Air Force, finding the failure points in new hardware before a frontline pilot ever has to. Recent satellite passes have shown Su-57 stealth fighters and S-70 Okhotnik unmanned combat drones parked on the ramp alongside more conventional aircraft, evidence that whatever Russia is planning to field next in the air war is, in all likelihood, being tested at Octubinsk first. The Okhotnik program in particular represents the kind of capability a facility like this exists to prove out. A large, flying-wing unmanned combat aircraft intended, according to Russian state media, to eventually operate as an autonomous or semi-autonomous partner to crewed fighters, extending sensor coverage and strike range without putting a pilot in the cockpit. A program like that does not go from prototype to combat-ready capability in a single flight. It moves through years of incremental testing, basic flight characteristics first, then sensor integration, then weapons release, then the far harder problem of coordinating an unmanned aircraft's behavior with a crewed one in the same airspace with Octubinsk as the one location in Russia equipped to run that entire sequence under controlled, instrumented conditions. This was also not the base's first encounter with a Ukrainian strike. In June 2024, drones reached the airfield and damaged a Su-57 on the ground proof. Even then, that distance alone was never going to be a complete defense. A modern flight test campaign for a new aircraft or weapon system typically runs not weeks, but years, broken into phases that each have to be completed and reviewed before the next begins. Basic airworthiness first, then expansion of the flight envelope into higher speeds and more aggressive maneuvers, then integration of whatever sensor or weapon is actually being evaluated, then operational trials meant to simulate how the system would actually be used in combat. Every phase depends on the aircraft, instrumentation, and personnel used in the phase before it. Damage or delay introduced at any point in that sequence does not simply cost the days needed for repair. It can force a program to repeat verification steps already considered complete, simply because the airframe or sensor package that produced the earlier results is no longer available in the same configuration to confirm the next set of results is consistent with it. Getting anywhere near that runway meant surviving Russia's early warning radar picture first, and that picture, at extreme range, is considerably more porous than it looks from a map covered in overlapping coverage circles. Ground-based radar does not see over the horizon. The curvature of the Earth limits how far any fixed station can detect a target flying close to the surface, and a strike drone holding a low altitude for hundreds of kilometers of open steppe simply does not exist, as far as most long-range early warning systems are concerned, until it climbs or the terrain forces it upward. Southern Russia's air defense architecture is built primarily around denser coverage near obvious high-value clusters, cities, major air bases, industrial centers with the wide agricultural and semi-arid land in between, covered more thinly, on the reasonable assumption that nothing valuable enough to justify the trip sits out there. For a formation willing to accept a longer, less direct route, that thinner coverage is not a wall. It is a set of gaps, mapped in advance, that a slow-flying, radar-quiet aircraft can string together into a corridor. That corridor eventually led into the Volga Delta itself, a landscape of braided river channels, reed beds, and low floodplain that offers a strike drone something a flat, featureless steppe cannot. Genuine terrain to hide in. A low-flying aircraft moving along a river valley blends into ground clutter far more effectively than one crossing open farmland, because the radar return from water, reeds, and uneven riverbank competes with and partially conceals the return from the aircraft itself. Southern Russia's air defense coverage is real and substantial, built primarily to protect against exactly this kind of deep strike. But coverage is not the same as certainty. A drone that spends most of its flight indistinguishable from background clutter along a river corridor is a drone that a defender has to work considerably harder to separate from noise before it can be engaged at all. The formation did not fly unmolested even after clearing the Delta's outer approaches. Electronic warfare positions covering the approaches to Russia's southern military infrastructure routinely attempt to jam the satellite navigation signal a strike drone depends on to confirm its exact position mid-flight, flooding the relevant frequency band with noise strong enough to drown out the faint signal broadcast from orbit. A drone that loses that signal does not necessarily lose its way. Modern long-range strike drones are typically built to fall back on inertial navigation the moment GNSS reception degrades, a system of accelerometers and gyroscopes that tracks the aircraft's motion from a known starting point, rather than relying on an external signal at all, accepting a small, slowly accumulating position error in exchange for continuing to fly a preloaded route with no outside signal to jam in the first place. Over a flight of many hundreds of kilometers, that accumulated error can matter. Over the final approach to a target the size of an airfield, rather than a single building, it typically does not. The formation continued on, largely by memory, in the electronic sense, trusting a route it had committed to before it ever crossed the border, rather than one it was still receiving instructions for in real time. The last line of defense belonged to the base itself. Airfields housing valuable test assets do not rely solely on distance and the regional radar picture. Short-range point defense systems, the same general family of vehicle-mounted gun and missile combinations used to protect other high-value Russian sites, are positioned specifically to catch whatever slips through the outer layers before it reaches the flight line. These systems are built for exactly this scenario. A small, slow, low-flying target detected late, and engaged at close range. And they are, under the right conditions, genuinely effective at it. The conditions that night were not entirely in their favor. A target arriving low over a river delta at night, already established on a track too faint and intermittent to generate a clean early warning, gives a point defense crew a compressed window to acquire, track, and engage before impact, rather than the extended engagement envelope those systems are designed around. Whether any interceptor left a launcher at Octubinsk that night has not been confirmed by either side. What is confirmed is that whatever defense the base attempted, it did not stop every part of the formation from reaching the ground. There is a particular irony in exactly what kind of aviation expertise Octubinsk keeps on hand, and how little of it was built for this specific problem. A flight test center of this size operates its own fleet of chase aircraft and safety monitoring crews, pilots and engineers, whose entire job during a test flight is to fly close support on an experimental aircraft, watching for exactly the kind of subtle mechanical failure a ground-based sensor could never catch from a distance. It is precisely the wrong skill set for intercepting an inbound strike drone at night, and precisely the right one for understanding, in painful detail, how much specialized capability a single facility like this concentrates in one place. The people best equipped at Octubinsk to notice when something has gone wrong with an aircraft are not, and have never needed to be, equipped to stop something from going wrong to the base itself. What ultimately reached the airfield struck with enough precision to put 2 impact points on the ground and set a fuel spill burning beside a parked Su-34. And it is at this point that the story stops being simple. Analysts poring over the released imagery could not agree on what precisely had been damaged. The aircraft's camouflage pattern did not match a standard Russian Air Force Su-34 in frontline service. One reading suggested an export-configured Su-34E, the variant Russia markets to foreign buyers, rather than flies itself, typically finished in a paint scheme distinct from the jet's flying strike missions over Ukraine. Export aircraft destined for a foreign customer are frequently cycled through a facility like Okhtubinsk for acceptance trials before delivery. Since a buyer is unlikely to accept an aircraft, Russia has not itself verified meets specification, which would mean the jet damaged that night belonged, at least on paper, to a country that was never a party to this war at all. Another reading suggested something stranger: a Su-34-based flying laboratory, one of the modified airframes Akhtubinsk uses specifically to trial new onboard systems, sensors, and weapons under real flight conditions before they are cleared for any operational jet. The kind of aircraft that exists to answer questions about hardware that, officially, does not exist yet either. Flying laboratories are not a new concept in Russian or Soviet aviation. Test centers have used modified airframes to carry experimental radar sets, targeting pods, and weapons release systems since well before Akhtubinsk took its current name, precisely because putting new electronics into the air on a stripped-down, heavily instrumented aircraft is safer and cheaper than putting them straight onto a combat-ready jet still expected to fly its normal missions. A testbed of this kind typically carries none of the defensive countermeasures or full weapons load of a frontline aircraft, trading combat capability for instrumentation racks, extra wiring, and telemetry equipment that lets engineers on the ground watch a new system perform in real time, rather than waiting to interview the pilot after landing. If the damaged aircraft was one of these test beds, its loss or delay would not simply cost Russia one airframe. It would cost Russia access to whatever specific system that particular aircraft had been built to carry, at whatever stage of testing that program had already reached, with no guarantee that a second test bed configured the same way exists anywhere else. Rebuilding that kind of aircraft is not a matter of pulling a new airframe off an assembly line. It means re-instrumenting a jet from scratch, and in some cases, waiting for engineering teams to reconstruct wiring diagrams and sensor mounts that existed until the strike, in exactly one physical copy. A third, more mundane explanation held that the aircraft was simply new off the production line, still wearing anti-corrosion primer ahead of its final paint job, caught on the ramp before it had even been formally assigned to a unit. New-build Su 3-4 SOWs are typically ferried to Octubinsk or a comparable facility for acceptance testing before delivery to a combat regiment. A bureaucratic and technical checkpoint every airframe passes through, regardless of how urgently the front might want it. Under this reading, the strike cost Russia a single production aircraft, rather than an irreplaceable test asset real damage. But damage of a kind Russia's industrial base can, in time, absorb the way it absorbs any other combat loss. The gap between this explanation and the flying laboratory explanation is, in practical terms, the gap between losing one item on a production spreadsheet and losing a physical embodiment of research that cannot simply be reordered. Each explanation points to a different level of loss, and Russia's own conduct in the days afterward did nothing to help outside observers choose between them. The Russian Ministry of Defense did not release a clarifying statement. Ukraine's general staff confirmed the strike and the fuel spill, and left the identification to outside analysts working from satellite photographs and camouflage patterns alone. Open-source channels on both sides of the war spent the following days arguing the same three possibilities back and forth, each side occasionally overstating its preferred version with more confidence than the underlying imagery actually supported a reminder that even in a war, extensively documented by commercial satellites and drone footage, some of the most consequential details of a single strike still come down to competing interpretations of a paint scheme photographed from several hundred kilometers up. None of those explanations are mutually exclusive with the base's purpose, and that is precisely the point. At a normal frontline airfield, a damaged Su-34 is a damaged Su-34, a known aircraft with a known role, doing a known job, and a known replacement cost that shows up eventually. In a production schedule, Russia already manages at scale. At Akhtubinsk, a damaged Su-34 might be any of those three things, and the honest answer is that an outside observer, working only from a satellite photo and a paint scheme, cannot fully rule any of them out. That ambiguity is not a failure of open-source analysis. It is close to the intended condition of the facility itself, a place whose entire operating premise is that what happens on its ramp should not be easy for an outsider to read. A test facility running an experimental airframe through its paces does not keep a spare sitting in a hangar the way a combat squadron keeps backup jets for a damaged one. Whatever this particular aircraft was for, it was very likely one of very few examples anywhere in Russia doing that specific job. By the following morning, satellite imagery showed the response to that uncertainty playing out in real time. Aircraft that had survived the strike undamaged were no longer sitting where they had been the day before. Some had been towed to dispersed positions elsewhere on the field, spread out rather than clustered, in the standard defensive response to a base that has just proven it can be reached. Others appear to have left Octubinsk entirely, flown to airfields farther from the border, where a repeat strike would need to travel even further to arrive. Ground crews who had spent the previous weeks running through a fixed testing schedule spent the following days instead on dispersal planning, hardened shelter prioritization, and the kind of defensive housekeeping that a base built around scientific routine is not naturally optimized to perform quickly. Moving a handful of aircraft costs Russia very little in absolute terms. It costs considerably more in what it silently admits, that a test center built around the premise of controlled, contained risk had just experienced an uncontrolled one, and that its usual answer to danger distance had briefly stopped being enough on its own. It is a strange kind of compliment to a Ukrainian drone that a base 70 years into the business of testing the most dangerous aircraft Russia builds still felt the need to relocate its fleet after one of them showed up uninvited. The same overnight window saw Ukrainian strikes reach considerably farther afield than Octubinsk alone, a refinery in Perm, more than 1,000 kilometers from the border, an airfield near Volgograd, and a drone launch site in Krasnodar Krai that Russian forces had been using to stage attacks on Ukrainian civilian targets. Octubinsk was one target among several that night, not the sole focus of it, which is itself a small piece of the puzzle. A base whose value lies partly in being difficult to justify defending as a top priority, surrounded on a given night by multiple other strikes, each making an equally reasonable claim on the same limited pool of air defense assets and analyst attention. This is not a one-off pattern. Over the preceding year, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign has steadily shifted from occasional, isolated attacks on obvious military targets toward a wider, more dispersed rhythm refineries, ammunition plants, radar sites, and test facilities struck in the same general window across multiple regions, forcing Russian air defense planners to treat an entire quarter of the country as potentially contested on any given night, rather than concentrating resources around a handful of predictable hotspots. Akhtubinsk's inclusion in that rotation, for the second time in roughly 2 years, suggests Ukrainian planners consider the facility valuable enough to keep revisiting, even though, by its nature, it rarely offers a target as visually dramatic as a burning refinery or a collapsed rocket assembly hall. What makes a flight test center worth striking is not what it currently has in the air over Ukraine. Frontline Su-34 squadrons will keep flying whether or not Octubinsk loses one airframe on the ground. What a facility like this actually controls is the pipeline behind those squadrons, the sequence of trials, evaluations, and certifications that decides which new sensor, which new guided weapon, which new unmanned aircraft eventually gets approved to reach a combat unit at all, damage a production aircraft, and Russia's industrial base can, eventually, build another one. Damage or simply disrupt the schedule of a test article performing a role. Few other airframes in the country are equipped to perform, and the delay does not show up as a gap in this month's order of battle. It shows up later, in whatever new capability was supposed to reach the front on a timeline that Octubinsk no longer controls quite as precisely as it did the week before the strike. A production line replaces what it loses in weeks or months, because replacing is the entire point of a production line. A test program does not have that luxury. Every trial that gets delayed pushes every trial scheduled after it, and there is no factory anywhere that manufactures more time. That distinction is easy to miss if a viewer is only counting airframes. Ukraine's broader deep strike campaign has, over the past 2 years, produced no shortage of footage showing large fireballs consuming refineries, ammunition depots, and rocket assembly halls, the kind of visually overwhelming destruction that needs no explanation to register as a strategic win. A single damaged Su-34 sitting on a runway, by comparison, looks almost unremarkable in still images. No towering fireball, no collapsed building, just an aircraft with visible scorch marks and a fuel spill beside it. The disproportion between how the strike looks and what it may actually have cost Russia is, in a sense, the entire lesson of targeting a facility like Octubinsk. Not every strategically significant strike of this war announces itself with a fireball large enough to be seen from orbit. Some of the most consequential ones look, from a distance, like almost nothing happened at all. There is also a quieter cost that does not show up in any damage assessment at all. Test pilots and engineers accept real personal risk as part of the job description at a facility like Akhtubinsk, but that risk has always been bounded by a set of rules. Everyone on the base understood: controlled airspace, known flight profiles, a threat environment, limited to the hardware they were themselves testing. A single strike does not erase that culture overnight, but it does introduce a variable nobody at a flight test center signed up to manage: the possibility that the danger might now come from outside the aircraft as well as inside it. Institutions built around calculated risk tend to respond to an uncalculated one by slowing down, adding precautions, spending time on security that used to go entirely toward the science. That too is a cost, and it is one that outlasts whatever gets repaired on the flight line within a week or two. A base that spends the next several months rewriting its dispersal procedures, hardening its shelters, and second-guessing which aircraft is safe to leave uncovered overnight is a base, spending institutional attention on survival instead of on the next generation of Russian air power it exists to build. If you think the identity of the damaged aircraft matters more to this story than the base's role as Russia's testing ground for future weapons, or the other way around, say which one in the comments below. If you want more reconstructions like this one, breaking down exactly how a single strike unfolds system by system. Consider subscribing to the channel. Peace for Ukraine, and let us hope wars like this come to an end soon. Goodbye.